My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas.
I'm, generally speaking, considered to be of the right. My background's in law and linguistics as well, actually. And I'm an educator. I was more popular. I have a much lower profile today than I did, say, 10 years ago, or between 7 and 10 years ago. You may remember at that time, especially in American politics, this was the tail end of, let's say, the libertarian moment, when a lot of Americans, young Republican voters were becoming more interested in figures like Ron Paul, let's say. A lot of youngsters moving towards libertarianism. Also, this was a time, especially after Trump, especially as, Trump had drawn a lot of that crowd, let's say, towards nationalism of some variety. There was the alt-right at the time. So this was, the dissident right, I think people call it more these days.
I remember that. And also the new right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah. The new right today kind of it more refers to, let's say, the French kind of alt-right. That's more a continental thing. But at the time there was the alt-right, and that kind of split with the alt-light, they call it. So this was a kind of maybe more ethno-nationalistic, civic nationalistic split that was going on there. And so I wrote a book called The Uniqueness of Western Law at that time. And my aim was more to get libertarians to start to reflect more on, why nationalism is important. What is it actually hitting at? What's libertarianism and, civic nationalism, maybe more broadly? What's that missing? What's that missing out on? What's it ignoring from Western history, let's say? And also, where you had, growing paganism, and you had a lot of anti-Christian sentiment emerging in the dissident right circles, I also wanted to promote that. I wanted to say, no, actually, to dismiss Christianity or Catholicism as being this sort of alien interjection to Western history, that's a complete mischaracterization, and you really can't understand Europe. You can't understand Western civilization without seeing this, this necessary flow. Catholicism was, in a certain sense, a perfection of the Roman project. That was my aim anyway. So I wrote that book, and I've written here and there, certainly people who were interested in politics at that time, and who were interested in maybe more right-wing politics. Since that time, you've probably read something I've written. You may not have seen my name, or it might not have been my name, but you've probably read something that I've written anyway. So broadly speaking, that's who I am. I'm a Catholic, and I always end up tangling with usually, actually, it's pagans on the right. I don't know how or why. That was never my intention, but I always end up in the middle of debates there. And at the moment, I'm working on 2 books. One is this debate I've been having with someone who I won't mention at the moment, about, is liberalism actually a resurgence of Gnosticism? Is it like a kind of heresy in a certain sense from the Western canon, Western tradition? Is there a spiritual element, I think, is what we're really getting at, with liberalism, modern liberalism. And the other book I'm writing about is about civilizational life cycles, which I think is, an area of interest for you as well, which I'm smiling because I don't get to have those conversations very often. And it's probably my favorite topic. So I think that's really cool. And yeah, I am coming at it from a Catholic point of view. I think if you're looking at civilizational life cycles, you can't ignore religion. You can't ignore the centrality of religion to human civilization, which is something that some of the greatest minds, most influential thinkers in linguistics, anthropology, biology, they're starting to converge on that same truth. I won't say theory; it's unavoidable. So yeah, that's the other book that I'm working on. Sorry, that was a really long introduction, but
no, it's absolutely perfect. You actually covered quite a lot of territory there, so I'm going to unpack some of that. I had E. Michael Jones on my podcast maybe about a week ago, and he's a Catholic too. And I said to him that I'm not a Catholic, but I find myself nodding at just about everything he says, and I find myself nodding at just about everything you say. And I find that interesting. Do you think that's because you are a Catholic that you have those views, or is it in addition to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, very interesting question. I think it is because Catholicism really tries to integrate so much of the natural world, and specifically I'm talking about natural law, the natural order. And one of the greatest, what can I say? I wanted to use the word advantages, because I'm thinking about, if you're as a Catholic trying to proselytize other people. One of the best traits of Catholicism is that it has the greatest system of apologia, apologetics, of defending itself, of any religion. And the reason for that is because it's so deeply integrated with this, let's say Western, but I'm talking about its origins in Greece and Rome, this tradition of rationalism, discovering the truths about the world. And so, Catholicism really ran with that. And so, the tradition that we have is so rich in terms of the contributions to law, systematizing law, especially, but also in furthering philosophy, furthering Platonic philosophy. And of course, at one time in our history, we're going back a long way now, but, there was such strong debate between Platonists, Gnostics, and Catholicism. And Catholicism won out, won the day. This is before I even go on to mention that it's primarily Catholics who founded the modern sciences and so many of the faculties that we associate with academic study today. So, the reason you're nodding basically is because we're taking so very seriously this art of trying to discover the truth, and to do so sincerely, not selfishly, not with any cynicism, but in order to be obedient to it. And the heart is that, like, the driving principle behind it is charity. So something else you're probably picking up on there is that it's well-meaning. We're trying to discern this truth, not for selfish reasons, but for the common good as well. So there's love there as well. So, without saying anything else, or trying to spiritually oblige you or anything, I think that's probably what you're picking up on there. That's why you are agreeing with so much.
So part of your introduction was Western civilization, Rome. Now, you write a lot about that, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, but I just want to clarify some terms. When you talk about the West or Western civilization, what are you talking about?
Yeah, it comes from Greece, I think. But when we say that, we're missing out on so much, because I think when we're talking about the European spirit, the European mind, and what makes that unique, it's something much deeper than to say, oh, it started with Greek philosophy. You kind of almost say, okay, and where did Greek philosophy come from, and why? Now, the namesake of my book, the reason I called it The Uniqueness of Western Law, was because I was so very influenced by Ricardo Duchenne, who was a professor at, I've completely forgotten the name of the university in Canada where he was a professor. Oh, that's really annoying. He'll be disappointed with me. But he was kind enough to write the afterword for my book, actually. So, I developed a friendship with him, thankfully. His theory is that Indo-European nomads, so at one time, it's a bit naughty to use this word now, but, Germans would have referred to them as Aryans. So that automatically is like shock horror.
All right, we can't say that these days.
No, I don't know if it's going to be on YouTube. Maybe we can't even say that there. But basically, what we're talking about is nomads from somewhere around the Black Sea, without going into all of that. And they came into Europe. In Northern Europe, they basically just eradicated everyone and replaced them because it's cold. And they're nomads and they have cattle and they show up and some other guys have just got some animals and so they just kill them and take their animals. In the south of Europe, they kind of formed a symbiosis. They kind of became this, because they're nomads and they move around, they became a kind of aristocratic protective force over the peasant, the settlers, the group who we would have called Old Europeans. That's like a technical term for them. So this is kind of why you see there is a bit of a genetic split between the north of Europe. You see guys, Germano-Celtic kind of people, they look a bit fairer. And the south of Europe, you do have that, like between 40 to 60% of their genes are these guys, these Indo-European nomad guys. And the rest is the old Europeans. And nevertheless, Europeans are kind of all cousins. And, I think half of all Europeans are descended from just one Indo-European guy. So, basically everyone's kind of closely related. And what that did, so what Ricardo Duchenne's theory is, to get to the point, is that these nomad warrior type guys, these guys would just strip naked, paint themselves up, and be ready to fight to the death, over just a matter of their honor. That requires a certain level of psychopathy to do that, for sure, yes. It's definitely, an interesting personality profile. But we have to say, okay, so Europeans are largely descended from those kind of people. So what's the result? Well, the result is, as Ricardo Duchenne points out, that you have people who are much more individualistic. And really what we're getting at when we're talking about that in terms of what kind of society they produce is they want systems of government, they want laws which recognize them as being rational, discerning people who care about truth in the world. They care about objective truths, and they also care about their kudos, their own glory. Like these warrior nomad guys, they were ready to die, for their image, right, for glory. So what that ends up producing is a kind of egalitarianism amongst the aristocrats. It's this kind of libertarian sort of, I'm not just going to kill all of my competitors and say, now I'm the despotic king. I actually want to have some other lords and barons and other guys like that around because they're the ones who respect me. They give me kudos. And And so this kind of aristocratic competition leads to competition in everything. And so Duchenne's theory is, well, this is where philosophy, which is this art that grows out of, Homer's heroic songs. Who can remember the hero the best and what his achievements were and why they were good, what's objectively good about them. And so out of that emerges philosophy. It's like, okay, so what are the virtuous principles? What really makes a man a great man? What makes me my best self? And so, this abstraction of thought, that's Greek philosophy. That's what they were doing. And that produces a certain kind of law. And the reason I say, okay, but you've got to be careful about just saying, oh, yeah, it's Greeks and Greek philosophy, and this is the Greek miracle, is because they were kind of doing something very similar all across Europe. And as an Icelandic friend is very quick to point out to me, in the Icelandic sagas, they really care about law and these objective principles and all of that stuff. What makes a hero, and so much of it is just, it can even be a bit boring. It's about law. It's supposed to be like a heroic saga, but there's sort of like courtroom drama going on, and there's philosophizing. And so I say, what makes the West so unique is, kind of who our ancestors are, and how that makes us think about ourselves. And that's not to be mean or to be dismissive of other great civilizations. It's just to be as factual as we can about what makes, what has made Europe and its unique attitude towards law what it is. And so, yeah, there's nothing mean-spirited about it. Unfortunately, Ricardo Duchenne, he was one of those last great scholars of Western civilization, which is kind of like a dying subject now. And actually, because he was touching on something which is so sensitive now, he was kind of forced into early retirement, which is a bit sad. But nevertheless, he's continued to write, so he's okay.
You mentioned Greece and Rome. So basically what you're arguing is that the foundations of Western civilization are linked, I suppose, to the Roman Empire and to Greco-Roman culture and customs and law.
Yeah, I mean, Rome is so important because we get our philosophy in general, let's say, from Greece. But in terms of how that's applied practically, in terms of politics, well, we owe that to Rome. And so Rome had the benefit of looking at all of the Greek city-state projects, looking at this polis and that and saying, well, what did they get right? What did they get right? And trying to create a system which would work. And we're still working on the same system effectively, just adapted ever so slightly here and there. Like, we're still working on a Roman model. There's a nice book called Ad Infinitum, I believe it's called, and the scholar writing that book, he's mostly looking at Latin, so he's looking at the Latin language. But, the conclusion he's coming to is that the Romans gave us just so very much in terms of our practical philosophy.
Wait.
Go on.
You said the Romans gave us, and I'm reminded of that Monty Python sketch. But what did the Romans do for us?
Yeah. And there was a documentary series when I was younger which had that title to it. And I remember at the time, so many British people, young and old, watching this and just being absolutely stunned by how much they did for Britain. And yeah, it's not surprising that, we know the story of Boudicca and, there's this rebellion against the Romans by, the British, that kind of thing. And, of course that did happen. I'm not going to say that they were angels and they weren't terribly cruel in Britain. But I think one of the reasons they were so cruel to some of the people was because, some of the other Britons were welcoming these guys with open arms. They're like bringing all this immense technology, baths, and just everything imaginable. And so, as well as like the writing, and it was like aliens landing with all this amazing technology, including the cure for cancer. And so many people were saying, well, this is brilliant, why wouldn't we want this stuff? And so so much of the elites amongst the Breton tribes, they did welcome the Romans. And so this is why we have the legends of King Arthur, and this is why I think the British politics has always been a little bit more liberty oriented as well. I mean, you could say there's something about an island people there, but I think that this embrace and running with the Roman political project, I think that helped tremendously as well. A lot of hiccups along the way, but enough about Britain. I'm just talking about it because I'm from there. It's more personal to me. But speaking more broadly, all of Western civilization is just us dressing up a Roman skeleton in all sorts of different ways, and calling it something maybe a little bit different here or there, but it's unavoidable. We can't do without it, and you especially see that in the legal system. In terms of international law, okay, yeah, that's more of a Roman Catholic development. International law is definitely something that Catholicism developed later, but I would argue that Rome made the idea of a sustainable global empire, like that kind of vision, made it something that was actually possible in a way that Alexander before, couldn't really achieve. So Rome couldn't be more important for our civilization, for civilization itself, frankly,
Just as an anecdote, I, as an African, a white African, obviously, my anxiety levels go through the roof because I can never decide whether or not I am Western.
Interesting, though.
Yeah. Going back to what you're talking about, the West, why then do all roads appear to lead to Jerusalem?
Interesting question. Interestingly put. I think certainly since the decline of Catholicism in the West, and people don't speak enough about just how revolutionary the Protestant Reformation was, because think of it. You have, prior to that, everyone perceiving Europe as this very definite corporate body. It's like a living entity with all of the many different kinds of polities existing within that, and everything in between, actually, because there are all sorts of religious orders and like guilds and all manner of different arrangements and organizations, which went between all these different jurisdictions. So it was truly a living thing. So when it suddenly became possible, and this idea then had political and financial support, when it became possible for an individual to decide for him or herself, what does the Bible say? And I'm going to absolutely determine that for myself. And it doesn't really matter what anyone else says or thinks. Something like that is like kryptonite to European people who, as we've already mentioned, are just naturally very individualistic. So this, any of this kind of egoism or spiritual individualism, when you talk about it even like in negative terms, this really riles up European people, especially British people, who are so liberalism is so intrinsically tied to British people's conception of themselves and their tradition. Anglo-liberalism is synonymous even with nationalism in this country, and so when you start to question, you say, well, does an individual even really exist? You come into this world, you're given a language, you are necessarily enculturated, like you have to be. And your very thoughts are so heavily informed of everything around you, and let alone the fact that this is a fact. The vast majority of people are not capable of original thought. I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm saying that because that is a scientific fact. We are just necessarily like group beings in every way. Even thought leaders who can afford maybe to be a bit more aristocratic, a bit more individualistic. Even they are reliant on having community, family, things of that nature. They're indebted to their country and where they got their language from, etc., etc.
So, sorry, go on.
No, I can see you thinking, I'm straying away from the point a little bit here. No, because I do think that is the crux. That was the turning point on which the West started to take a very different course. We moved away from a corporate conception of ourselves to where today, following there being also political liberalism and the various revolutions over centuries that wrought, we arrive at this point now where we are hyper-individualistic, which is the term that's used to describe the West today, where we're even at the point now where it's a commonplace to think in terms of, well, soon we're going to be able to transfer our ego from our biological body into a computer. We'll be able to live forever. This is like a trope now. It's almost boring, like we've seen it done so many times in sci-fi over the past 10 years. And so, your question was, how do all roads then lead to Jerusalem? I think what we're asking is, how is it that, the Western mind has so divorced itself from Rome and a corporate conception of itself that international forces, you're talking about, Jerusalem in terms of, having political influence, over Western countries, let's say. And, unfortunately, we're seeing that play out right now in the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran is asking America, hey, can you tell your ally to, please stop attacking Lebanon? And they can afford to put that in the agreement because they know, no, America can't really do anything about that. So it's a clever play. Now, the reason they can't do anything about that, and the reason that the West has its hands tied behind its back in all sorts of different ways today, and we see a complete dissolution of anything resembling a Roman identity and everything that we had before that, that corporate concept. We had a very clear understanding of our story as Westerners, our story as Europeans. I think that ultimately stems from a spiritual individualism. That would be my answer.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned Protestantism, because it's not something that I've thought much about over the years until it came up perhaps a few months ago in conversation, and how it potentially weakened that Roman identity across the West. That's essentially what you're alluding to.
I am, yes. I don't want to, throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were, because, I have lots of Protestant friends who take their country seriously. They're patriots, and they seem to love God. Maybe even putting me to shame. They have a strong love of Christ, and they're well versed in Western history broadly. And so I'm hesitant to say, all Protestants like that are, enemies of Rome, and they're necessarily anti some kind of Roman identity. I don't want to do that, but I can't ignore the fact, necessarily there is an egoism to this rupture that's happened in the church. Having been for several years a devout Protestant myself, I have to say necessarily that there's necessarily a lack of a corporate identity in Protestantism, and that is just so obvious from the number of different churches that they have, and but this is a whole other debate. I'm kind of opening a can of worms here a little bit, but it should be no surprise. As a Catholic, what I see is that yes, there is this divorce from Rome, literally in terms of from the Bishop of Rome within the church, and there is necessarily an individualism. There is a spiritual individualism. And, if you read some of my writing, I do go into where I liken even some of the more traditional, serious forms of Protestantism, like Calvinism. I do look into similarities between that and, Gnosticism and other schools of philosophy and theology, which are more individualistic and which are necessarily anti-Catholic on that basis, and how that informs the politics. And so why it's completely unsurprising that political liberalism was born from Protestantism directly. So, I can't ignore that, but, I do love Protestants individually. I know how that sounds. I'm hoping you believe me.
Well, yeah, you are being remarkably diplomatic, and there isn't a need to. You don't have to be so diplomatic. But your point about hyper-individualism in the West is well made. It's something that has bothered me for a long time, and I've never been able to put my thumb on it. Like, why has it been the case that the West is so ultra individualized? I was in China last year, and it's not like that. There's a sense of community and collective family. What's the word? Prioritization, and yes, it's almost as though hyper-individualism, as you referred to it, is a direct attack, therefore, on what it means to be a family unit, a community. The kids must leave the nest when they turn 18, go away. Yeah. Just everything must break apart. It doesn't seem conducive to a good, solid future.
No, not at all. And you're mentioning the breakdown of the family, that kind of thing. And people say, well, what's incentivizing this? I think that a part of the genius of Christ was where he presented man's spiritual dichotomy, the struggle, not as between, God and Satan, not like that, not between God and self. He said God and mammon. He said you can't serve them both, to paraphrase. And that seems to be the mechanism by which civilizations decline and collapse. Yes, so many students of civilizational collapse will readily point to how the attitudes of men, it turns from one of service to selfishness. But how? How? What are the patterns that we see every single time? Why is it that the greatest students of civilizational collapse will say that they die through suicide, not by murder? What's going on there? And I think it has something to do with mammon. I think it has to do with technology. And mammon is that central, how can I put it, ultimate technology. Money is that technology by which we believe we can do anything. Everything suddenly appears to be within our control, whereas actually it isn't, and we're being as foolish as Icarus. That's what that story is about.
But if I'm following correctly, you're kind of making a parallel then with liberalism and Gnosticism.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, look, Protestantism doesn't get to escape here either. Many authors have talked about how, yes, okay, in fairness, that is correct, capitalism, modern capitalism, did emerge in northern Italy, which was Catholic. That is absolutely true. Why did it find a new home, though, in the Netherlands and Britain? Because that was a much more habitable environment for it at that time, once Protestantism had come on the scene. And allying itself with more secessionist, smaller, urbanite, Calvinist Protestant experiments, it was able to become much more industrious. Indeed, to start the Industrial Revolution from those two countries in particular, in a way, far in advance of others, let's say. And so, yes, this spiritual individualism, not only is it just, it's kryptonite for white people who are more individualistic, but individualism is the main symptom of a civilization in decline. It's if you will, it's even the death throw of a civilization, or of a smaller polity, like an empire, for instance. It all follows the same pattern. And so it's where there is success, where there is victory, where there's peace, then where there's trade, rather than fighting outside enemies, all the enemies outside have been defeated. So a civilization will turn inward. The competition then becomes internal. It becomes economic. And where there is the ability, because there are the resources available in a successful empire, to develop more technologies, especially in the cities, of course, and to massively increase their urban populations, there necessarily then is a hubris. There's necessarily a hubris. There's far too much leisure, let's say, on people's hands. And the idea of needing to have men, martial values and masculine men, this becomes something archaic, brutish, vulgar. And so, yes, technology, mammon, this is something seductive to us. It is something dangerous to us. And so every collapsing empire and civilization follows the same process. And, this is why it's so politically important to maintain a handle on your technology, to be able to ensure that technology, property, everything is nevertheless wielded towards the common good, or at least not wielded against the common good. And that involves our money. That involves money. And so, we live at a time where everything is financialized. And even, desire is something that is generated as a product. You don't need to watch Mad Men to get that and to know what's going on. And so, although I don't necessarily want to just go on some massive like anti-capitalist screed or something like that, because of course there would be plenty we could say about the left. Something that is important to understand is that, we actually, in what I was just saying there, we associate capitalism so much with the right. But is that correct? Is it right to do so? Is having everything financialized and having international monetary influence over nations, is that right wing? No, that's extremely liberal. That's liberalism. And yet, well, look at all the conservative organizations. They're all very pro-capitalist, and you have lots of Catholic ones as well. Actually, lots of right-wing notable Catholic authors, and they are fully on board. They sound like neocons when they're talking about free markets and this kind of thing. So that was a really long-winded answer to your question there, but I do think that's something important to bring up. I was saying before, religion is so important for civilization. I'd say mammon, in particular, that's the civilization killer, and that's kind of the thing we want to be watching out for, talking about more.
You've mentioned left-right labels a few times. Now, I've argued in the past that these terms are kind of redundant these days because nobody can really define them. They had a meaning once upon a time, particularly around the French Revolution. When you speak about left wing, right wing, what do you mean?
Yeah, that's so important. Firstly, I agree with you completely. What do I mean by left wing and right wing? Well,
I mean, there's no harm in using the terms if we can define them.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's the thing, is that they do kind of mean different things to different people, and they get co-opted. Since the Cold War, the term right wing has been co-opted to mean exactly what I was just talking about. It kind of means small government, free markets. It's like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They became the dominant right wing figures. But is that actually right wing? It's changed so much. Another example we might mention is the fact that environmentalism not that long ago was something of the right. Romanticism, and caring about the environment. This was like a revival of Franciscan Catholic attitudes about the world, and it was perceiving beauty in the world, as this undeniable thing to try and generate again in the West higher values, being more objective and virtuous and not atheistic or something like that. So that's completely changed as well. So your question was, what would I mean when I say left wing and right wing? Now, there have been some authors who would say, well, when we're talking about the right or right wing as Catholics, we would be thinking about Christ sat on the right hand of the Father. And so when we talk about the right, we're talking about what is right and what is good, what is truthful. And so we're kind of talking about everything that is conducive to the common good. Now, when we talk about the left, and you have to ask, well, what is the word left literally in lots of languages? Latin languages, it's sinistra. It's sinister. So like it means evil, to the point that even when my mother, rest her soul, when she was at school, they would, tie left-handed children, tie their hand behind their back, so they couldn't. They had to learn to write with their right hand, because there was something demonic about using their left hand. I shouldn't laugh. It's kind of cruel. It's not that funny, but. So when I'm talking in terms of the left and the right, I really want to simplify it a lot more. And I want to say we're really talking about, what builds up civilizations, what sustains civilizations. And like I said, what's conducive to the common good. And then what leads to this individualism, what leads to people wanting to take advantage of any of those systems for cynical reasons, for selfish reasons, for mammonistic reasons. And that's kind of what it means to me. But, that just sounds too vague for people. Okay, so what policies are you talking about? What party do I have to vote for? This is where then, people want to have something concrete and practical. They want to be able to look at someone or some group and point to that and say, right, okay, so these are the guys. This is the group. And I get it. I think that we do have to be a little bit more discerning. Collapse is upon us. The enemies are within the gates, as people would want to say. Western countries are in a real dire state. The UK especially, for all sorts of different reasons, some of which I probably can't even discuss because, I don't know, maybe it's illegal. I don't know. That's just how mad things are at the moment. And so we do have to be a bit more discerning. We do have to get clued up, and we do have to be circumspect.
So if I'm following correctly, basically Judeo-Christianity is a nonsensical term. It should be Roman.
As a Catholic, when I'm looking at my tradition and I'm looking at the church's role in the West and what that is, I do have to recognize, all right, yeah, but I mean, things have been different like since the 1500s. A lot's happened since then. And so, I have to recognize then that there are other people who they have views which are by now kind of long-standing, and they perceive the West as something completely different. And they don't even have to be like Protestants or Jews or something, because, even Oswald Spengler, who, loads of people on the right, love him. And, to their mind, when they're thinking about civilizational life cycles, he's the guy. He's the one that they've read, and his ideas and his vocabulary is in their head. So, but he perceives the modern West as a separate civilization to, like Roman Catholicism, definitely. He sees it as there's a Faustian civilization, I believe he calls it. And so he would view, the British Empire as being something completely different to the Roman Empire. So they're just far too divorced to his mind. I don't go with that. I don't think that's true at all. I think that British Empire, Napoleon and what he was doing, the Spanish Empire, I think all of that stuff is very clearly built on a Roman model. They kind of thought of themselves as Roman. So my perception of Western history and Western civilization is that it's the church. It comes out of Rome, and Rome is its beating heart. And so, I look at Roman Catholicism as a continuation of the Roman Empire. And
okay. I'm sorry. Let me jump in. I'm following you. Sorry. So when I said Roman, I probably should have said Roman Catholic rather than Judeo-Christian.
Yeah. So, I mean, what you were saying was, would I say that we're not built on a Judeo-Christian foundation? Because, I mean, that's very popular. That language is really popular at the moment. But, when you look at academic writing about that terminology, suddenly everyone is willing to recognize that this is a bit of an oxymoron. What do we mean by this? It's actually so tentative where this might actually be applicable, this term, that it would be a bit careless just to use it in politics and say, hey, this is Western civilization, and then in the same sentence say Judeo-Christian, because it's just dishonest. If I were to have a conversation with Jewish friends, and actually some Jewish converts to Catholicism who I know, they would say, obviously there was this massive, rupture where we had two Jewish-Roman wars in the 1st century. And this concluded with Prince Titus getting really cheesed off that one of these revolutions had just killed so many Romans. And so he sent this enormous army just to wipe everyone out. And the Roman temple was destroyed famously in 70 AD, kind of unforgettably. And if you speak with, Jews, especially Jews who are, practicing, religious Jews, or if you speak to, a lot of folks in Israel, so where, their identity is like a strong, important daily part of their lives, they remember this. They look back and they think about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And so, what happened after that then? Okay, well, we have a Jewish diaspora. Were they always welcomed everywhere? Has there been this, great symbiosis everywhere? And it was, well, no, we have to acknowledge that there has been a lot of turbulence, let's say. We can just leave it at that. We don't need to go into any details, or we don't need to offend anyone. It should be something that, I should avoid. But that's the truth. Those are the facts. So, when we're talking about Judeo-Christian, well, what do we mean then? Okay, well, as a Catholic, my understanding is that, Christ came. Christ was the Messiah. Now, at the time, he was rejected by not all, but, a number of his people, especially leaders in Jerusalem at the time. And so, a new kind of Judaism, that's how we would call it, formed afterwards, and it's based on the Talmud, and so it has its whole history, but nevertheless it's something kind of post-Christian, and so the way we perceive it, and contrary to what a lot of traditional Catholics actually will tell you, in the Second Vatican Council, sort of 60s, 70s time, the documents produced talking about this and talking about our relationship with the Jews, they reaffirm, what we've always believed, which is that Although the covenant that Jews have or had as a nation, so that, that Moses and the tablets of stone and, this particular priesthood and everything like that, although that came to an end with the destruction of the temple, this promise, which was much earlier, to the figure of Abraham, which is that, don't worry, everyone, the whole world is going to start to become a monotheist like you, Abraham. Your children will be like the sand of the sea. And, don't worry that you're surrounded by polytheists. This is going to win out in the end. That promise to Abraham is fulfilled in Christ. And, he was the Messiah because, well, look, he's brought the whole world, to worship one God and to live in peace with each other. Arguably Christianity has been a great force for peace in the world, developing international law, like I said, and, creating, fairer laws and, just generally, us stopping, not killing each other in colosseums and stuff like that. So
you are going to get pushback, though. You know that they're going to say, but look at all the wars that were caused in the name of Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. People are going to talk about the Crusades, or they're going to talk about colonization, and all of these hot topics. All these buttons that can be pushed at that point. But I'm just saying, what I believe as a Catholic, and what our view is, and so our story of what Western civilization is, as the people who actually built Western civilization, is that it's Roman, and Roman Catholicism is a continuation of that. It's a continuation of that Roman experiment. The church inherited the Roman Empire, and it would take me way too long to go into that, but there is a great book by someone called Alan Phimister, with an M, Phimister, and it's called The Iron Scepter of the Son of Man. It has this long subtitle as well, but it's just absolutely brilliant because this view, the way the church understood the prophecies and how and why Rome had to inherit the kingdom of God after the Messiah was rejected in the 1st century AD. Why, all of that. He brings all of that together brilliantly, and I thought was a great book and needed, because we've just forgotten this story about ourselves. But the other thing is, Jerm, is people are going to look at what I'm saying and they're saying, oh, so you're saying that people who have like this, Jewish perspective on what Western civilization is and their role in it, oh, you're saying that they're wrong and they have a false understanding, and that when they tell their story, what they're doing is they're lying and they're deceiving people or something like that. And it's like, no, I'm not saying that they're out to try and like poison your mind or something. Obviously, okay, they're going to have their own story. I'm just saying, okay, but what Western civilization actually is what it was always recognized as, which is something that was built on a Greco-Roman heritage, and Roman Catholicism was a natural continuation of that, and that is what Western civilization was built on. Just like I'm going to get pushback, I'm sure, from some people who love Spengler or some of these pagan guys I always end up debating, and they're going to say that they have their own kind of pagan perspective on Western civilization. And, they think that Christianity was this massive rupture or whatever. No, I disagree. And I think it's almost unarguable that the Roman Catholic Church built Western civilization, and that, we should be able to tell our own story, and that other people shouldn't think that by doing so, we are rejecting them out of hate or something, which is just obviously nonsense.
How can I follow your work?
I'm on X, Twitter, if anyone still calls it that. You can find me there. I don't think I'm called Richard Storey on there. A lot of my friends call me Rick, spelled R-I-K. Don't ask why. So I'm at Rick Storey. You can probably find me on X there under that handle. I think I have a picture of myself and beardy guy with specs, so you'll be able to see me there. Also, I write a lot for a publishing house called Arctos, A-R-K-T-O-S. And they publish a number of really interesting articles. It's going to be stuff that you're not going to find on maybe other right-wing publications, but it's a really broad tent of stuff that they publish there, including me. They're happy to have me there. It's not an exclusively Catholic thing at all, by any means. And there's a lot of debate that goes on there as well. But there's always some, interesting content for right wingers there as well. So I'm starting to write a bit more now, so you can probably find my articles there every now and then.
Richard Storey, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.